So what I'm going to talk about now is the scientific basis of what is the knowledge that we can claim that organic agriculture may contribute positively to sustainable livelihoods and food security for smallholder farmers, basically. I know there are a lot of people also in this room that have their own personal experiences, and I often meet people from the NGO world that says, but we know it works, so why bother to do the research? But I work also with politicians and with fundraisers, and they are always asking for the evidence. Now, let's first look at the growth of the organic agricultural land. In all over actually in continents, it has been growing for the last 15 years, and also in Latin America, even though it seems to have been stagnating around the 6.8 million hectares for the last 5 years. Still, if you look at the partition between continents, you still have Oceania with Australia and Europe as the main regions for continents for organic agriculture, but still it is significant in Latin America as well. And if we look at the countries with the largest numbers of organic producers, you will see that there are several countries in Latin America, and not the least Peru, with more than 65,000 organic producers. We may come back to later in the discussion who are they, and I'm sure in the room there are people here with knowledge on how organic agriculture, what it looks like in Peru. For me, it's been a research question for quite some time to say, is organic agriculture a model that is conducive to improve the livelihood of smallholder farmers? This is from one farmer, Mr. Kagagwe and his family I know in Uganda, with very few resources, both in terms of his farm, but also in terms of his knowledge. He has one resource which is abundant, and you can see that on one of the photos. And he very seldom gets visits from extension or other forms of new knowledge. And he has very little capital, so for him to buy chemical inputs or fertilizer would require a loan. And in many countries, also in Asia, I know of, the farmers would have to pay at least 30% of interest, so it's not really so interesting. And on top of that, he faces the challenge that the rain patterns are changing, so he's not really sure when the first rain comes today, is it like in Lima, only a little shower, so he should wait sowing, or should he go out sowing immediately? And therefore, well, also his link to the market is weak, and very time-consuming, maybe for his wife. If they have a little surplus, it's not easy to sell at a good price. And of course, therefore, if they have any other option, his many children, they will think twice before they continue farming. And I think from a societal perspective, this is another very serious question. And I have, during the last 2 weeks, visited a number of farmers in the Andes, in Cuzco, in Cordillera Blanca, and they all say the same. It is difficult to attract the young people into farming because of these harsh conditions. Now, so the question is, how can organic agriculture or agroecologia, how can that improve this situation so it becomes more attractive to become a farmer? One of the concepts to study this is the livelihood concept, which is used widely also in development world, and you probably know it, but it's very helpful as a researcher to think of a farm like Mr. Kagagwe or in the Andes or in Asia, think about 5 different capitals that a small family can have. It can be their human capital, educational level, physical strength, health, and so on. It can be the social capital. I have visited here in the Andes communities who preserve potato varieties. That's a strong social capital. It can be the natural capital, the quality of the soil, etc. It could be the physical capital, the storage rooms you have, or other forms of transportation to the market. And it's, of course, your financial capital. The combination of these 5 capitals determines also your resilience, the way you can deal with shocks. So smallholder farmers are vulnerable to shocks in terms of sickness for themselves or their animals, changes in market access, diseases of the crops and so on, seasonalities, and then the critical changes like the climate change I talked about. So the better you can manage your capital assets, the more you have a chance to be resilient. And of course, there are also policies and institutions that could support the farmers, or maybe they are not there, but it's part of the picture. And all of that together determine your livelihood or the farmer's livelihood strategies, and therefore what we call the livelihood outcome, the way they use the natural resources, their income, their food security, and overall well-being. Now, the food security, it's important, and I'm just reiterating a classical distinction here used by the WFO and FAO. So food security is not only the question of how much food is produced in an area, but of course there need to be food production, but it also needs to be accessible for the family, so they need to either produce enough for themselves or have an income so they can buy food in the dry season, if that's necessary. And then it needs to be a balanced diet, and it needs to be enough for all members of the family. I'm not so familiar with the family patterns in Peru, but in other areas of the world, women and children eat the last, and there may not be enough food for the whole family. And then, of course, it needs to be food throughout the year. Now, we all know that there is a challenge for future food security, and even though on a global level today, there is actually enough food in terms of calories and protein, we still have almost 1 billion people being food insecure. We have another 2 billion people being obese and don't have a proper diet. So when we are facing another 2 billion people at least before the population growth phases out, how are we going to feed them is the critical question I get often from politicians and others when I talk about organic farming. But then to that question, it's important to say yes, but we are also already degrading the natural resource base, the biodiversity, the soil quality, etc., to an extent where it actually threatens also the yields in conventional agriculture. And on top of that, we have this climate change, which, according to recent reports, really already is affecting farmers, like I described I've learned recently from the Andes, but also from East Africa and other places. It will be a real challenge, and we all know probably the term, the buzzword, the climate smart agriculture, whatever that is. But that's also an aspect of organic agriculture we need to look into. Now, when I say organic agriculture, I basically think of this definition from IFOAM, sustaining healthy soils, ecosystems, and people, and relying on ecological processes, biodiversity, nutrient cycling, etc., adjusted to local conditions, local available resources, and combining the tradition, the thousands of years of tradition of agriculture in Peru, not the least, with innovation and science to benefit the farmers. I know that in Latin America there is also an alternative term, agroecologia, which sometimes is a movement, sometimes is a set of practices. For me, and come here over the last 10, 15 years, mostly in Brazil, and I know that sometimes it creates tension. I hope today we can just think of it as a set of innovations that farmers can help farmers, and some of it is more directed to market, others is more the agroecology, in some forms is more directed to self-sufficiency in a good system, but both. The term I'd like to refer to is agroecological practices, and that is what we need to develop further. So for me, there are more parallels than differences, so I hope we can leave it there for today. And I build very much on the 4 basic principles that we defined 10 years ago for organic agriculture: the health, ecology, fairness, and care. And if you're not totally familiar with that, I would encourage to go to ICROFS website and try to learn that. And you will see it is very similar to the agroecology in many ways. So basically in many developing countries, what I see is that there are 2 forms of organic agriculture. There's the certified, which is oriented more or less towards products, because the advantage of paying the expensive certification is that you have an increased market access, often with higher prices. So it tends to be focused on high-value crops and quality. And the agroecological practices I talked about are used in various degrees. It's an increasing market, but of course it will remain some kind of a niche if you compare to millions of smallholder farmers. But then there's the other part of it, which we can call the informal organic agriculture, which is perhaps the agroecological farming systems. Somebody told me that in many parts of the Andes, people just don't use pesticides and fertilizers, so that's also organic. I have little knowledge of that so far. You can judge for yourself. But for me, organic agriculture still means improving and intensifying compared to the just not using any inputs. And that's why I call it a conscious use of agroecological practices. So it's also still about constantly thinking about improving soil fertility, using the local resources, diversity in time and space, natural regulation, etc. Now, as I said, there are a lot of organizations that consciously work with this, with smallholder farmers in Asia, Africa, and I'm sure in Latin America also. The SOCLA is well known. So we see in practice that these methods work and they can improve the livelihood of communities. But the evidence is still the scientific evidence of that is still relatively scarce, I would say. Everybody is referring to this study by Jules Pretty, where he asked a number of NGOs 10 years ago to report how they think the yields had improved in their projects using organic or agroecological principles. And it was concluded with the support of UNEP and UNCTAD that it really is conducive to food security. And in a subset of this study, they looked at a large number of projects in Africa and showed that the yields had actually more than doubled in average. So for about 2 million hectares, the yields had increased by 116%, a little different between different countries. You have to acknowledge here that these were self-reported improvements. So these are what the NGO is reporting themselves. Now, still, what was actually more interesting was the mechanism. So they talk about 4 types of improvements in using agroecological practices. One is intensifying the kitchen garden, the small plot that all farmers have around their house to produce food and herbs and so on for themselves. The other was introduction of new elements, fish farming, multipurpose trees, other types of which sometimes is very knowledge demanding, like this fish farming in Cambodia. And combining that with the multi-purpose trees like Calliandra or other that can feed the fish, or in times of crisis even feed the family. Then it was better exploitation of natural resources like mulching, using soil cover, feed crops along the hedges, water accumulation, etc. And then there were increased yields in basic crops. So the legumes, better genetic material, and so on, prevention of crop damage. Now, I'd like to go more into detail with an example, a case study from India, or rather 3 locations in India, together with a PhD student, Paneer Selvam here. We did a survey of households in three parts of India, where there were such organic development projects. One in Tamil Nadu was aiming at mostly improving the livelihood and the self-sufficiency of food for vulnerable farmers. The other one in Madhya Pradesh was mainly about certifying organic crops, cotton and other, for the export market. And in Uttaranchal, it was also a combination of improved market access, higher yields for home consumption. So these are one of the farmers in Madhya Pradesh, and one of the main results was actually the reintroduction of legumes. And it sounds rather trivial because, you know, India, most people are vegetarians and they eat a lot of pulses for their dal. But in fact, over the last 10, 15 years, or maybe 20 years, India has become importer they don't produce that much legumes anymore in their crop rotations, whereas they've become a net exporter of wheat, even in periods of time where they have 300 million food insecure, which again shows you that food production availability is not a sufficient condition. Now, we could show that in all 3 cases, but for instance, in the Uttaranchal region, the reintroduction of agroecological practices, improved crop rotation and soil fertility, increased the production of process, but also the home consumption. So the food security was improved. For other crops, the yields were actually decreasing. The organic systems there have a difficulty of supplying enough nutrients to wheat and rice. The total farm production in Uttaranchal was increasing. So I'm trying now here to give you very briefly some of the results in the 4 categories of food security, or the 4 dimensions. So as you saw, the intercrop production was increasing, and the food kept for home consumption in the 2 case areas were significantly increased. When it comes to food access, since they had lower input cost, it also made available cheaper food. For the crops that they sold, they would have a higher net margin. And because they didn't have to borrow money at a 30% interest rate for pesticides and fertilizer, their financial situation improved a lot. They were not as indebted as they were when in previous. So even if they had slightly reduced yields in cotton, wheat, and rice, their resilience was improved because of a better financial capital, you can say. And they had an improved market access through these projects with organic crops. Whether these agroecological methods really improved food stability, well, over 1 year it seemed so, but over the years to come and in terms of climate change, we couldn't test that in this project, and I think that is still an open question which we need to document a bit more. In all cases, I would say that for really poor smallholder farmers with very limited capital, even organic agriculture is not a silver bullet that just transforms everything into nirvana. It is still a difficult livelihood for these farmers. We should acknowledge that. Now, just a quick going through some other case studies we did in Asia. with the support of the Asian Development Bank Institute. 2 places in China and 1 in Sri Lanka. We also did surveys of 100 organic and 100 conventional households in each case area with long questionnaires. The interesting thing here is, again, the difference between the very market-oriented approach and the more self-sufficiency, improving local food security approach. So in an area with tea, there were companies promoting, as you see in the picture, organic tea production, where they had already a well-established market access. In another area in Jiaohu, the organic project started with a few crops where you needed, it was ginger originally, where you need crop rotation and a certain volume. So the whole village had to convert. And in a county, you had a number of villages where all farmers had converted to organic. And that promoted the development of many market chains, because companies who had a market for organic bamboo, soybeans, even strawberry, they came now to this community and said, can you also produce this and that? So in short, the case study where tea was actually the only organic value chain, it had very limited effect on people's health, on gender aspects. It gave a little more cash. You could say the main effect was that in those unfavorable mountain conditions, there would still be tea production because it was certified organic. All the conventional tea production in China has moved down to the lowlands to be more intensified. But you could not really detect a large improvement in the farmers' economy. Whereas in the whole village project, there was community development, increased market access, capacity building, a diversion of agroecological methods, as you can see in the picture, and also in people's health, because in 1/3 of the 100 households, on the 200 households, both the man and the woman interviewed separately indicated that there had been significant health problems due to pesticides previous to the organic conversion. In the organic area in Sri Lanka, the main effect was that it preserved and enhanced biodiversity and the classical candied tea garden. It's a forest tea garden, agroforestry system that was maintained and improved through the marketing access. But what was very clear also was that the real improvement at a community level, you remember the social capital, the real improvement came when you also had a fair trade certification. Because you might know that, but whereas the price premium for organic products go to the individual farmer after his negotiation with the company, the fair trade price premium goes to a community. So in order for the farmers to get the benefit from the fair trade extra price, they have as a community to decide what to do to support young people to study or to buy a flock of sheep or improve their health care in the village or something. Just to be more specific, in that community area in Jiaohu in China, this is a breakdown of the economics of the crop production. So you can see that comparing the organic and the non-organic statistically, there was a significantly higher value of the crops sold, and their cash costs were lower, so of course their net cash income was significantly higher. So even if you included the value of when you included the value of the crops that they eat themselves, there was a difference to the benefit of the organic. And when you also imputed a labor cost on their own labor, still there was a higher profit in the organic systems. The value of the livestock was the same. So you would say they were better off in the organic systems. And that's significant. But however, when you compare the total value of crops and livestock, which was higher in the organic, you compare that to what we call remittances, the money that the family staying in the countryside gets from the relatives that goes to the city for work. That's the total non-farm income. You see, that is significantly higher than any agricultural income. So it's still a question whether simply introducing organic practices and organic value chains into smallholder systems, if that is enough to make it attractive for the next generation of farmers, is questionable. But what we did see in that area is that some innovative entrepreneurial young farmers, they would rent the land from other families where the people anyway had gone to work. So we saw a re-influx of young people starting to farm, because with the organic system they had a market access and a low-cost system where they didn't need to invest and borrow, and they could have a good livelihood. So, but I think then you need to combine the organic and accept that it's not to conserve necessarily the structure of very small farms, but you also need to accept some kind of structural development for the entrepreneurial small farmers. That could be a hypothesis at least. Finally, in this round of examples, I'll just refer some other studies from Asia that basically says the same. You can look at the red circle, that because of the very low cash costs and sometimes a higher market price, even with a little lower yields, the farmers are better off in terms of their net revenue for cotton, for the soybeans, and for the rice in the Philippines. Now, to sum up this part, and I've learned this. I've borrowed this idea from Charles Gallagher, and did a PhD in Uganda, looking at different ways of organizing organic agriculture there. And he basically saw, and I think it fits with what I just presented you, that you can talk about the non-certified organic agriculture in terms of the food security dimensions. It focuses mostly on improving food crops, improved management, yield increases. It does not necessarily have a price premium or improve the market access, but it does give a better stability in terms of diversity of crops and so on. It has a little capital building, but it can improve a lot the human and the social capital. And for me, what I've learned about the agroecologia movement, that is very suitable. If you have the certified organic agriculture, it focuses on cash crops. So there can actually sometimes be a moderate change in management of the food crops. And the learning, the capacity building can be moderate, as you saw in the tea project in China. But it can also be organized so that you have both, that you have capacity building for your food crops as well as for your market crops. But if you get more income, more financial capital, of course, that gives you another type of resilience in your family, and you can also buy food to improve your food stability. So, coming to the last part, what is interesting then is to see what does it take to improve the market access for the smallholder farmers. How can organic agriculture improve that? As I described for this Chinese village, because it was the whole community that converted, they could get a contract for a factory that needed organic strawberries for freeze drying for American breakfast products. I even found that the picture of the breakfast where the strawberries ended, I took in Davis near San Francisco. So it actually was a whole value chain developed. So the way I see it actually is that if we can get consumers to pay this price premium for those products from smallholder farmers, it is actually an investment in the development of agroecological farming that will also benefit those who are more into agroecologia without necessarily market access, because we can develop the methods. We can get funding and ideas into developing, like this pineapple project in Uganda. And well, this is a bit technical, but if you talk about, we can see at least 4 food systems or market avenues in developing countries. You have the traditional wholesale market, or you have the which is very difficult for smallholders. Then you have the picture I showed you, which I've seen in abundance here in Peru as well. Individual farmers working or selling their products, sitting there half a day for a few soles. But if we can increasingly get smallholders or medium-sized farmers organized in a way where they can go into more specialized wholesale markets, even supermarkets like this, then it could benefit a lot more farmers. But there's a lot of organization needed to go all the way from farmer wholesale to retailers, even export markets. And we are working on that in a project in East Africa, together with researchers and farmers. How can you do research at the same time at the farm level and at the value chain? And as you can see, there are a lot of things that can break up. First of all, you need to be sure that you have the quality aspect in mind, because it's a lot more difficult when you want to reach the retail or the export markets to be sure that you have a constant high level of volume and quality. You cannot just go to the market when you have a bulk and then sit there and negotiate, oh, this has a blemish, so I'll give it to you cheaper. No way the supermarket is going to organize that. So you need to really reflect a lot more the quality from the market into your production, and therefore into the research we do with farmers. It's not only about yield, it's also about the quality. And we do that, try to do that in this project. But there's a lot of places where this governance of the value chain can break up. For instance, if a wholesaler has finally got a contract with an export or a retailer, a supermarket in the town, for 10 tons of pineapple to be delivered 2 months from now. And then when he goes there, half of the farmers just sold a week before their harvest because somebody else came by and offered a slightly better price, or what do I know. Then the whole thing breaks down and you don't have the confidence. So there's a lot of organization, what we call value chain governance, that needs to be handled to another extent than when you sell to the local farmers market in Cusco. So we are just trying to do that kind of research, and I think there is a lot more to be done, where we combine research and innovation at the farm level with the value chain and the quality aspects. So the final slide here is about what actually is the title of the workshop today, because in as much as I've described how challenged it is to create these market access and the proper systems that improve livelihood for smallholder farmers, there is actually a new trend arriving, even also in Latin America, Brazil and Peru, which is taking advantage of policies developed at the city level, where public kitchens, communes want organic food or agroecological food for the public meals, or restaurants, chefs, like here in Lima, wants to promote good modern food based on classical products, and therefore also request organic or agroecological. And it can be combined with environmental policies, like in Nairobi, for instance. There's a new water fund that wants to protect the water by promoting agroecological practices in their water reservoirs, and then take the food from these agricultures into the city. So this new connection might provide a new avenue for developing organic agriculture. It is very difficult, but this is, for me, the next research agenda. How can we do that? Thank you.